Hi there, I'm Miro Krenha with Our Daily Planet, and today we have with us Nathaniel Stinnett, who's the executive director and founder of the Environmental Voter Project, which has been a wonderful organization that we've pushed our readers to help volunteer with and to get involved with. And they engage and identify likely environmental voters and help get them to the polls. So it's been a really wonderful group that we've covered and have seen do incredible work. So we're so happy to have Nathaniel with us, and thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Miro. I'm really excited to be here.
And Nathaniel, I wanted to ask firstly, what have been some of EVP's biggest successes this election, and kind of what can climate activists take away from the election and a lot of your activities and work?
First, I think it's important to stress that 2020 wasn't just about the presidential election for us. So we were active since January using every election, the local elections, presidential primaries, state primaries, as behavioral interventions to begin turning non-voting environmentalists into consistent voters. Everything great that happened in September and October and November kind of stood on the shoulders of that first 9 months of work, because voting is a behavior just like a lot of other behaviors. And all of that previous work built up to this fall. That being said, for obvious reasons, I understand why people are interested in the presidential election. Just from September 1st to November 3rd, we were targeting 1.8 million never voted before environmentalists in 12 states.
Wow.
So they had never cast a ballot before. We made 3 million calls, sent 1 million pieces of mail, 4.3 million texts, almost 89 million digital ad impressions. And the big takeaway for us, but also for your readers and watchers, we know that 609,000 of those 1.8 million never voted before environmentalists, we know from public voter files that they voted early. So 1/3 of them voted early, including 57,000 first-time environmental voters in Arizona and 69,000 in Georgia. These aren't just good numbers for the Environmental Voter Project. It's also really good news for the climate movement, because we're coming into our own and really projecting significant political power here.
Georgia and Arizona were two top of mind states for me to ask you about, because you were active in both of those states and they flipped. So was that a surprise? Did you see it coming? And where's the next one? Is it Texas, or is it a different one, a different state that we maybe should be looking at?
Honestly, I'm not sure that either Georgia or Arizona were a huge surprise. So, both states have been consistently trending purple. And certainly, the Environmental Voter Project was there for a reason. We moved into Georgia in 2017. We moved into Arizona in 2019 because we recognized that there was this huge pool of non-voting environmentalists who could really make a difference if turnout was boosted. But, it's one thing to recognize a political opportunity and another thing to actually take advantage of it.
Capitalize on it. Yeah.
Totally. And so the Biden campaign and the larger progressive movement certainly deserves an enormous amount of credit in turning Arizona and Georgia blue, because we live in a fairly static political environment, even with all the Trump craziness. So I don't know if it was an enormous surprise, but yeah, they were surprises. They were surprises. As far as what states could be ripe for the Environmental Voter Project to expand into, that will certainly be funding dependent. But first, we're going to continue working in our existing 12 states. So Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. We're going to continue working there because local and state elections are every bit as important for policymaking as federal. But second, we'll definitely be looking for new states, and our criteria will remain the same. Which states have huge populations of non-voting environmentalists? Where are we leaving a lot of political power on the table? And it's kind of a grab bag. We've got some big blue states like California and New York that we think have lots of unused political power.
That's interesting.
Yeah, some purple states like Texas, absolutely, Ohio, but also some red states. I mean, places like Kansas and Alaska have huge populations of non-voting environmentalists, where if we show up and start voting, we can really drive policymaking.
That's a really interesting takeaway. We became a little more attuned to that this election, of the potential of places we think are traditionally red or traditionally this or that are more progressive. My next question, I wanted to preface with saying that we know the Latinx community is not a monolith, but there was polling before the November election showing that the community did care about climate and environmental issues, mostly because a lot of Latinx communities are really on the front lines of where climate change is happening most severely. And so I wanted to ask, why was it that a large tranche of Latinx voters voted for Donald Trump, who's been, the most anti-environmental, anti-climate president? I know that's probably a loaded question, but would love your insights.
I think the first thing to understand is just because Latinos are more likely to care a lot about climate change than other ethnic and racial groups, that doesn't mean there aren't a huge number of Latinos who don't care about climate change, right? So for instance, Pew Research Center did a poll in September showing 60% of Latinos said climate change was very important to their vote. And that's a big number. A big number. The remaining 40% is also a big number, right?
Sure.
So 40% who don't care about climate change, many of them probably did vote for Donald Trump, who ended up getting 32% of the Hispanic vote. I think it's really important to parse out when we do have really interesting data nuggets like this that reveal certain demographic groups are more likely or disproportionately likely to care deeply about a particular issue. That doesn't mean that there aren't millions of people just like them who couldn't possibly care less about that issue. So that's one sort of important caveat. The second thing, though, as for why that may have happened, or why some of these partisan breakdowns in the broader Latino world are shifting over time, I think there are two important nuances to dive into. The first is, as you alluded to, there are big differences within this huge demographic group that we just call Latinx.
Mm-hmm.
So, Tejanos in South Texas are different from Mexican Americans in Arizona.
Or Cuban Americans in Miami.
Absolutely. And even like Puerto Ricans in Orlando are different from Puerto Ricans in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And so, there's just a lot there. But second, I think we also need to pay attention to long-term trend lines. Trump is so new and crazy and disruptive that we like to think that everything else crazy has to have happened in the last 4 years. And I'm not sure that's what's going on here. I mean, there's been a fairly consistent trend line for decades where Latino support for Democrats has been slipping. Now, again, though, remember what I just said before, like we shouldn't view this as some monolithic demographic group, but neither should we view it as some huge blip on the trend line, because it's not. Ultimately, what this reveals is if the progressive movement doesn't do hundreds of focus groups, not just with Latino voters, but with Latino community groups over the next 2 years, well, shame on us, because something's going on here that no one really understands in a deep way.
Yeah.
That's really helpful context. I think, heard a lot of pundits debating this point, but you put it so well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to dig into that other set of demographics that you hinted at that we're trying to figure out here, which is, who were your 600,000 new voters? And is there any sort of demographic makeup of that group of people, or were they just varied and you just found them? How do you define this new group of environmental voters? Because clearly there are more of them. You turned out a huge number. There's still 1.2 million maybe that are potential, and there's even more out there in other states. So who are those folks?
It's a great question. And the short answer is, yeah, it's a really, really varied, and there are quite literally thousands of data points that help us identify these people. Similar to our discussion about Latinos who care about climate change and Latinos who don't care about climate change, yes, there are a lot of demographic trends that we can pull from these super environmentalists and super environmentalists who aren't voting. But that doesn't make the inverse true. That doesn't mean that every young person cares about climate change just because more young people care about climate change. That being said, I'll go ahead and actually answer your question. Certainly, young people, people of color, and people who make less than $50,000 a year are all dramatically overrepresented in this population of people who don't just care about climate or the environment, but list it as their number one priority. A second thing that we see, and this is consistent in every single one of our 12 states, is a gender gap that increases with age. So
sorry,
yes.
it's me.
I'm talking about people who are much, much older than you, but
You're too kind.
So if you look at 18 to 24-year-olds, yes, women are more likely than men by about 3 to 5 percentage points to view climate or the environment as their top priority. But the older you get, such that you're looking 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, when you look at people in their 70s, women are sometimes 20 or 30 percentage points more likely than men.
Wow.
To list climate or the environment as their top priority, something we like jokingly refer to as the grandmother effect. And who knows if it has anything to do with actually having grandchildren, but something's going on there. So those are the trends that we see. But again, I don't want to mislead you into thinking that mere demographic data points can be predictive on their own. They're not. We use thousands of data points to identify these environmentalists.
Speaking of data points, this is the burning question of this election, and something we saw in 2016 too, is that pollsters got a lot wrong about this election again, it seems like. So is polling a dying industry? Like, what's the takeaway? Or is it a matter of changing the metrics we use and the way that we capture data about voter behavior, to get a more accurate picture of what these trend lines are?
Yeah, I mean, you asked the $1 million question there. And
just to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're putting me on a spot. That being said, I'm not a pollster, but clearly
yes.
we live data here at the Environmental Voter Project. I'm going to do what I've been doing a lot so far over the last 10 minutes and start with a caveat. This is what you get when you interview nerds like me. The caveat is we'll know a whole lot more in 2 or 3 months when voter files are fully updated and we can do really like nuanced and precise analyses of these things. Mm-hmm. But I think there are a few takeaways. The first is, the polls were more uneven than they were inaccurate. For instance, like the polling average in Pennsylvania before Election Day had Biden winning by 1.2%. And you know what? Biden won Pennsylvania by 1.2%. Like, it was pretty good. And the polls were pretty darn accurate in Georgia and Arizona and even North Carolina too. Yeah. But on the other hand, there were some huge misses. I mean, Wisconsin, Florida, the Senate race in Maine, dear God.
The Senate race in Maine, right. So far off.
Right. And so in many ways, that unevenness is probably going to make it even harder to analyze what's going on here than if there was just sort of an across the board error. The second thing that really stands out to me is the polls underestimated the strength of down ballot Republicans more than they underestimated the strength of Donald Trump. So I don't really buy this theory of the shy Trump voter effect. Instead, I think, and again, we'll know more when voter files are updated, I think what we're seeing here is that polls were simply unable to contact a particular group of conservatives. And so this is a polling problem that you can't weight yourself out of, like WEIGHT. It's not an analytical problem with your numerator. It's like a surveying problem with your denominator. Right. Like you're just completely missing a part of the electorate. And that's going to be hard to solve if that's the case. Like, I'm really glad I'm not a pollster, because if there's a certain group of people who just aren't picking up their phones or answering texts or being part of web panels, like, that's hard to fix.
I know most people think the election's over, other than maybe Donald Trump and all those Georgians out there who still have a Senate runoff, 2 Senate runoffs going on. So tell us what you're looking at, what are you guys doing, and how can our readers help down there? Because obviously so much is hinging on those 2 races.
So much. And I feel so bad for the poor people of Georgia. They're probably just tearing their phone cords out of the wall. The first thing we're doing is looking backwards a bit. Just earlier this fall for the presidential, as I mentioned to you, the Environmental Voter Project helped get 69,000 first-time voters who prioritize climate to vote early. And so the first thing we're going to do is go back to those people and leverage the fact that they just voted for the first time.
Do it again.
Exactly. I mean, this is like behavioral science gold. Like we want them to preserve this new special identity they have as voters, and like we've already got our hooks into them. So,
and the deciders, I mean, like, they made a difference. It's not hard to persuade them that their vote mattered, because it did.
That's exactly right. Like, all those people, the first time they vote in like a dog catcher election, well, who the hell cares? Whereas these people, like, they were the deciders. You're right. So that's the first thing we're doing. The second thing is, in total, we are targeting 382,000 Georgians who have a very high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority yet they are unlikely to vote in these runoffs. And we're calling them, we're texting them, we're mailing them, we're sending them digital ads, all with behavioral science informed messaging that's optimized for each communication channel and each demographic group. And then third and finally, timing is crucially important. Like, I know donors are fatigued, I know volunteers are fatigued, I know voters are fatigued. We can't wait for the last minute in these elections. I mean, early voting was a crucial factor in November, and it's going to be a crucial factor again in Georgia in December and January. And ballots are already being mailed, they're already being returned.
Wow.
In-person early voting starts on December 14th.
Wow.
And this election is going to be over before we know it.
Yeah.
And so we've got to act quickly. And you're very kind to ask about how people can get involved at the Environmental Voter Project. They can go to environmentalvoter.org. You can sign up to volunteer at environmentalvoter.org. You'll immediately get an email that will provide you a link to almost daily phone and text banks where you're contacting these unlikely to vote environmentalists with all the messaging that we know works to get them to vote. If you want to donate, we've got a $700,000 budget just for these Georgia runoffs, and we're about 70% of the way, and we'd love generous.
But that last 30%.
It's exactly. And again, the last thing is just folks have to act quickly. Time's a wasting in Georgia, and as we just saw in September and October, Election Day is when voting ends. It's already begun in Georgia. I mean, I think at the time we're having this discussion, over 17,000 Georgians have already had their ballots counted.
Wow.
So Election Day's here. We got to all get in the game again.
We'll definitely put this in the email. And I can tell you that I did volunteer for you guys during the general, and it was fun and it was super easy. You made it very easy for me to connect and to get engaged, and I loved it. So I would encourage it. And we love talking with you, Nathaniel. You're like our environmental Steve Kornacki. You know this group of voters, and we want to get to know them better. We love talking politics, particularly when it comes to the environment and climate. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you both so much for having me back. Anytime you want me, I'm here.
We'll take you up on it.
Absolutely.